My name is Simone Adeyeze Okafor. I am 31 years old, and the night everything in my family finally broke open, I was standing in a narrow hallway in Decatur, Georgia, at 7:43 in the evening, holding the pieces of the only professional blazer I owned. The blazer was midnight blue, Ann Taylor, long line fit, 3 small gold buttons at each cuff that caught the light in a way that made me feel, every single time I wore it, like I had already arrived somewhere I'd been trying to get to for a long time. I paid $187 for it, across 3 installments on a store credit card, $62.33 in October, $62.33 in November, the final $62.34 in December, because I was a 27-year-old data analyst making $54,000 a year in Atlanta, and $187 was not something I had available all at once. I wore it to exactly 2 professional events before that night: my annual performance review at the Harwell Group, and my cousin Regina's baby shower brunch because I'd run out of clean options. It hung in the guest closet of my parents' house in Decatur in a dry cleaning bag because my apartment had so little closet space that I'd been storing my winter things wherever I could find a wall. I had a job interview the next morning. Senior Product Manager at Meridian Tech Solutions, a mid-sized software company with offices on Peachtree Street in Midtown Atlanta, 18th floor, view of the skyline I'd already pulled up on Google Maps because I do that. I look up the view from the window before I research the salary because I need to be able to picture myself somewhere before I can believe I belong there. The salary was $92,000 base, plus equity and benefits. For context, that was $38,000 more per year than I was currently earning. It was the kind of door that, if it opened, would change the shape of the next decade of my life. I never walked through it in that blazer. Before I say another word, where are you watching this right now? Drop your city and the time it is where you are in the comments below. I mean it. I read every single one, and tonight, I want to know exactly who is in the room with me, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that lands differently, depending on where you're sitting when you hear it. Before we go any further, please like and subscribe, but only if what you've already heard feels like something you need to hear the rest of. And leave your location and local time in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you are right now. I need to take you back to the beginning, because the blazer didn't exist in a vacuum. Nothing in this story did. To understand what it meant to have that jacket cut apart the night before the most important morning of my career, you have to understand the house I grew up in, and the family that ran it. And you have to understand that what happened in that hallway was not an accident, and was not the first time, and was not even, really, about a blazer. My father, Emmanuel Chukwuemeka Okafor, arrived in Atlanta from Lagos, Nigeria, in August of 1985, with a civil engineering degree from the University of Lagos, and $47 in his pocket. He told us this figure so many times throughout our childhood that it became the family creation myth, the $47, the number from which everything else was calculated. He found work with the Georgia Department of Transportation within 2 years of arriving, spent the next 3 decades working his way to Senior Infrastructure Project Manager, retired at 62 with a pension and a handshake from the commissioner, and has lived in the same 4-bedroom house in Decatur's Belvedere Park neighborhood since 1994, a house he bought and has never once considered selling because it is, as he says, the first thing he ever owned that no one could repossess. My father is a precise man. He files his tax documents in color-coded folders, tracks his blood pressure in a dedicated Excel spreadsheet, and approaches emotional situations the way he approaches infrastructure problems, by identifying the load-bearing element and eliminating variables. What this meant for his 2 daughters, practically speaking, was that when we required different things, he defaulted to the daughter who required less from him. That was Chioma. My sister, Chioma Adaora Okafor Banks, 2 years and 11 months older than me, is the kind of person that people describe before they describe themselves. Spelman College on a full merit scholarship, communications degree in 3 years, married Kofi Banks, architect, wonderful family, genuinely a good man, At 26 in a wedding, my mother spent 14 months planning, and my father still references when discussing the best day of his life, which tells you something. Chioma lives now in a 5-bedroom house in Sandy Springs with their children, Amara, who is 6, and Tobias, who is 4, whose crayon drawings cover my parents' refrigerator so completely that the actual refrigerator is largely theoretical at this point. My sister is beautiful in the way that makes strangers attribute competence to her before she's said a word, and she has a warmth to her that is entirely genuine, which is what makes the dynamic between us so hard to fully explain, because Chioma is not a villain and never was. She was just the one our parents chose to illuminate, which left me, perpetually, in the shadow that light requires. I am not bitter about my sister's life. I want to say that plainly. What happened between us was never about jealousy, even though I spent years letting my parents make me feel like it was. What it was about was what our parents decided our respective lives meant about them. My mother, Grace Nwaneka Okafor, 59 years old, administrative coordinator for the DeKalb County School District's Facilities Department, has been in that role for 17 years and is exceptionally competent at it. She is a woman who runs every room she enters with quiet authority and who loves her daughters with the specific fierceness of a person who confuses the people they love with the image those people reflect back on them. She loves Chioma the way you love something that confirms your best understanding of yourself. She loves me the way you love something you haven't quite been able to categorize. Still love, genuinely, but uncertain around the edges, waiting to see what I eventually become, as if my becoming is still being decided at 31 years old. I was a complicated child by my mother's standards, though I don't think I was complicated by anyone else's. I asked too many questions. I was interested in patterns and systems and numbers in ways my mother could not easily translate into conversations at church or at dinner. I tested into the gifted program at Druid Hills Middle School in 6th grade, which my parents acknowledged once and let go of. I won first place at the Georgia Science and Mathematics competition in 9th grade, an event at Georgia Tech's campus where I stood at a podium in front of 300 people and received a trophy that was nearly as tall as I was. My mother said when I got home, "That's wonderful, Simone," and then turned to Chioma and asked how rehearsals for the school play were going. I set the trophy on my desk. It's still there, in my old bedroom. Nobody has moved it. I'm not sure anyone has looked at it since. By the time I graduated from Dudley High and enrolled at Georgia State University on a partial academic scholarship, I had internalized something I never had a name for until I started therapy at 28. I had learned to keep the things I was building to myself, because the people in that house would not see them clearly, and their inability to see clearly was more damaging than their absence of interest, because at least an absence is honest. What my family gave me was interest filtered through a fixed conclusion, that Chioma was the impressive one, and I was the one who was doing okay. I graduated from Georgia State with a degree in information systems in 2015, $23,000 in student loans, and an offer from a business intelligence consulting firm called the Harwell Group at $48,000 a year. My parents attended the graduation. My father shook my hand at the ceremony as if we'd just concluded a successful infrastructure review. My mother hugged me briefly and said, "Now you just need to find a good man," which is perhaps the most efficient compression of her priorities I have ever witnessed in 9 words. I moved my things into an apartment off Piedmont Avenue, started at Harwell the following Monday, and began the very long, very quiet, very unglamorous work of building a life that nobody in my family was watching closely enough to see. By 27, I was a senior data analyst at Harwell, salary raised twice to $54,000, and I had been spending nights and weekends doing something my family knew nothing about, building a product management portfolio from scratch. I took online courses through Product School. I completed 2 certifications through Pragmatic Institute. I volunteered as a product manager for a nonprofit called the Atlanta Tech Village Education Arm for 8 unpaid months because I needed the experience on my resume and I was willing to do whatever it took, in whatever time I had, to close the gap between where I was and where I could see myself being. I was not waiting for permission. I had stopped waiting for permission around the time I realized that permission from certain people is just another word for limitation. I want to stop here and ask you something, because I think many of you already know the particular texture of the room I'm describing. Has a parent ever made you feel chosen second? Not with their words, not out loud at any single moment you could point to, but in every accumulated small daily way that adds up over years into something you can't unfeel. Not the grand betrayals, but the small ones. Whose report card got held up at the dinner table, whose name got said with a different warmth, whose achievements got mentioned at family gatherings, and whose got filed away somewhere quiet. If that's you, I want you to tell me which parent it was. Just mom, dad, or both. Drop it in the comments. I want to know how many of us grew up in that particular kind of invisible. The Meridian Tech Solutions opportunity came through a LinkedIn recruiter on a Thursday in November. I applied Friday morning before work. A screening call came Tuesday of the following week, followed by 2 technical rounds that I spent 3 evenings preparing for, with a level of precision I had never brought to anything before in my life. Product roadmaps printed out, annotated, rehearsed out loud in my kitchen at 9 p.m., with the window cracked because I was nervous and my apartment ran hot. I made it through both technical rounds. The final interview, the one that mattered, the panel interview with the VP of Product and 2 directors, was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. I needed the blazer. It was hanging in the guest closet of my parents' house because I'd loaned it to Chioma back in January for an industry conference she'd been invited to present at, and my mother, without asking me, had told her she could borrow it. The conference had been postponed twice. The blazer had stayed. I'd been telling myself I'd get it the next time I was home. The next time was now. I drove to Decatur on Wednesday evening, got there at 7:15. My mother was in the kitchen when I came through the back door, a pot of tomato stew on the stove that meant she'd been cooking since at least 5. She makes the stew when something is sitting in her chest that she doesn't know what to do with. I said hello. She said hello, back in the voice that is a single note pitched just below normal. The voice that means something has already happened, and she is bracing for having to explain it. I did not yet know what I was being braced for. I walked down the hallway to the guest room. The dry cleaning bag was in the closet, right where I'd left it. I unzipped it with one hand, already half thinking about the morning, about the route to Peachtree, about whether I should eat before the interview or after. I pulled the blazer out of the bag. The left sleeve was attached to the jacket body by approximately an inch of remaining seam thread. The back panel had a lateral cut across it, 4 inches wide, clean-edged, the kind of cut made by proper fabric scissors in a single deliberate motion. The right cuff was missing one gold button entirely. The lining at the hem had been separated from the shell, either in the cutting or in whatever came after the cutting. The midnight blue fabric was the same midnight blue it had always been. The Ann Taylor label at the inside neck was intact. Everything that had made it the thing it was, the structure, the line, the professional authority, was gone. I stood there for a moment with it in my hands. I want to describe accurately what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what people who weren't raised in my particular house might expect. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a kind of suspended recognition, the way you feel when something confirms a pattern you've been trying not to see for a long time, and the confirmation is so clear that there's actually a second of stillness before anything else arrives. I walked back to the kitchen. My mother looked at the blazer. She looked at the pot on the stove. She adjusted the heat on the burner. I was trying to take it in at the waist for Keoma, she said. She has the conference rescheduled for next month, and she wanted it fitted differently. The seam ripper slipped while I was opening the side seam, and then I was trying to fix where the ripper slipped, and I made it worse, and the button just... She paused. I'm going to get you a new one, the exact same one. I found it on the Ann Taylor website already. Mom, I said. My voice was very steady. It surprised me how steady it was. It'll be there in 3 to 5 business days. I have the link saved. My interview is tomorrow morning. At 10 o'clock. She turned from the stove to face me. There was something on her face. Not guilt, exactly. And not the absence of guilt either. Something in between. The look of a person who genuinely cannot feel the full weight of what they've done because they've never been asked to feel it before. "You have other blouses," she said. "Not a blazer. Nothing close to professional enough for a VP-level panel interview." "Simone, you always look nice. You don't need something specific to, Mom." I said her name again, the way you say a word when you need it to be a sentence. "Chikelma didn't have a conference when you offered her this. You lent her my things without asking me. It's been hanging here for 9 months. And now I have the most important job interview I've had in 3 years tomorrow morning, and you're telling me to wear a blouse." I want to pause right here, because this is the moment in this story that I need you to sit inside with me for a second. Has someone in your family ever destroyed something that was yours, something with real cost attached to it, real meaning, something you'd worked specifically to get, and then responded to the destruction with a practicality that told you, without any ambiguity, that they did not understand and had never understood the weight of what they'd broken? Not anger, not even defensiveness, just a kind of flat, untroubled problem-solving that made the broken thing somehow more broken? Tell me what it was. Drop it in the comments. I want to know, because naming these things out loud is part of how we stop carrying them as if they were ours alone. My mother offered to drive me to the mall. It was 7:43, and the malls in the area closed at 9. We went. We walked through a Macy's on Memorial Drive that was in the process of closing out a section of its women's professional wear, with half the rack already picked over, and the remaining options either a size too small or in colors that would have photographed as costumes. I tried on 4 blazers in 14 minutes in a dressing room that smelled like cleaning product, and none of them were right, and none of them were going to be right, because none of them were the one I'd saved for, and chosen, and owned, and had relied on. At 8:51, we drove back out of the parking garage without buying anything, and I pointed my car toward a 24-hour Target on Memorial Drive. I stood in the women's clothing section of that Target at 11:17 at night, and I found a black blazer on a metal rack between a rack of graphic sweatshirts and a display of throw blankets. Polyester rayon blend. $32.99 on the tag. One size too large in the shoulders, which I confirmed in the dressing room mirror under lighting that flattens every feature and forgives nothing. I stood there and looked at myself, and I said out loud, to my own reflection, in a Target dressing room at 11:17 at night, the night before my Meridian interview, "You are doing this anyway." I bought the blazer. I bought a safety pin from the travel accessories aisle to hold the left shoulder seam in place, because the sizing was off, and I couldn't have it sliding while I was talking about stakeholder alignment. I drove home to my apartment off Piedmont Avenue, set an alarm for 6:30, laid my clothes out on the chair in my bedroom, and did not sleep well and did not expect to. I did the interview anyway. Sandra Kinnear was the VP of Product, a compact, precise woman in her mid-40s who asked questions the way someone asks questions when they've heard every rehearsed answer and are specifically listening for the moment when the rehearsal breaks and the person underneath it becomes visible. She asked me about my road mapping philosophy. I told her. She asked me to walk her through a product failure and what I'd extracted from it. I walked her through a data pipeline project at Harwell that had launched 6 weeks late because nobody had established clear ownership at the sprint review level, and I told her specifically and in sequence what had gone wrong, what I would have changed, and how I had restructured the oversight model after the fact. She wrote something in her notepad. She looked at me with attention. I didn't get the job. They promoted internally. The recruiter called me 2 weeks later with the news, professionally and kindly delivered, and I thanked him and hung up and sat at my kitchen table for exactly 15 minutes doing nothing. Not crying, not screaming, just sitting inside the silence of something that had almost happened and hadn't. Then I opened my laptop and registered for an advanced product analytics certification through Pragmatic Institute. $1,400, charged to a credit card, because I had decided in a Target dressing room the night before that I was not going to let a single setback be the end of a sentence I hadn't finished writing. Here's something I want to ask you, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. Have you ever built something important? A skill, a credential, a career, a whole other version of yourself, entirely outside your family's line of sight, because you understood that if they saw it while it was still being made, they would decide it was never going to be finished? I kept everything I was building for nearly 3 years away from my parents. Every certification, every application, every professional contact, every small win that felt fragile and real. I need to know if you've done that too. Comment what you built. I genuinely want to see it. I want to see what we've all been quietly making in the rooms our families weren't watching. The years between that Target dressing room and what came next are the years I am most proud of, even though they are the hardest to make interesting in a story, because the interesting part of rebuilding is never what it looks like from the outside. From the outside, it just looks like someone going to work. Inside, it was the first time in my life I was building something entirely for myself, with no audience and no approval to wait for. And that absence of waiting turned out to be the most productive condition I'd ever worked in. I got 2 more raises at Harwell, landing at $63,000 as lead data analyst by the spring of my 28th year. I started freelancing on the side, building product requirement documents and roadmaps for early-stage startups through a referral network I'd been quietly cultivating for 2 years. I made an additional $14,000 that year in freelance work. None of it was mentioned to my family. I need to tell you about 2 people who changed what I understood about family and about belonging, because this story isn't only about the people who failed me. It's also about the people who didn't. The first is Kezia Osei. She joined the Harwell Group 11 months after me, a business analyst who'd come from Howard University by way of Accra, 26 years old at the time, with the particular confidence that comes from being raised by someone, her grandmother, as I later learned, who told her consistently and specifically that she was worth listening to. Kezia and I ate lunch together for 3 weeks in a row before we were actually friends, the way some friendships accumulate gradually before they announce themselves. Then, one afternoon, she looked at my laptop screen while I was working on a product roadmap template and said, simply, "Why are you doing this at a data job?" I told her everything. She said, "When's your next application going in?" As if the answer were obvious. Kezia became the person I called at 11 p.m. when I got rejection emails. The person who read my cover letters and was honest when they were too formal, and honest when they were too informal, and right both times. She threw me a small celebration in her apartment in East Atlanta Village the afternoon I passed my Pragmatic Institute Advanced Certification. 4 people, Trader Joe's wine, a grocery store cake with samomi, written on it because the bakery had misheard her over the phone, and she'd decided that was funny, not a reason to return it. I sat at her kitchen table eating that cake with the wrong name on it and felt more celebrated than I had since I was 15 years old, winning a math competition in a room where nobody who shared my blood had been watching. The second person is Thomas Drummond. He came into my life as a senior advisor at a product management workshop series at the Atlanta Tech Village in the fall of my 28th year. 53 years old, had built and sold 2 product companies, the larger of which was acquired by a private equity firm in 2018 for a number I won't repeat because he told me in confidence, but which explains why he now advises people for reasons other than compensation. He told me once, over coffee at a place in Ponce City Market, that he had spent 15 years being the only person in the room who looked like him, and that he had no intention of allowing that to be someone else's story on his watch. He took an interest in what I was building and what I was building toward. Over the course of 18 months, he gave me 3 pieces of specific, actionable career advice that I followed precisely, and each of which opened a door I hadn't known was close enough to knock on. And then there was André Laurent. 33 years old, originally from New Orleans, graphic designer, the kind of man whose laugh arrives before the punchline, and who listens not as a social performance, but as a genuine and complete intake of information. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming in Grant Park when I was 28. He was funny and attentive in equal measure, and the second time we had coffee, he asked me about my work in a way that required him to actually understand the answer, which meant he asked clarifying questions, which meant he was paying attention, which meant I was completely unprepared for him. The third time we spent time together, he remembered something I'd said in passing the week before, that I was nervous about an interview, and he texted me that morning to ask how it had gone. Such a small thing, an almost embarrassingly small thing. And I sat with my phone in my hand looking at that text for a full minute because I was not used to someone remembering the small things I said. I was not used to someone making a note of what mattered to me and following up. We were dating seriously by April, and I learned, slowly, and with some resistance at first, because I had been managing everything alone for a long time, what it felt like to have a person who was interested in the specific interior architecture of who I was, not the version of me that was polished, not the version that was useful, but the actual Simone, the one who did her best work at kitchen tables at 10 p.m. and had strong opinions about product sprint reviews, and cried once, at a music festival, at a song she couldn't explain, and didn't try to. My family knew nothing of any of this. Not Kezia. Not Thomas Drummond, not Andre, not the certifications, not the freelance work, not the savings account building toward a Kirkwood condo down payment. They knew I worked in data. They knew my general address. They knew I came home for Christmas and Easter and major events. My mother occasionally relayed Chioma's latest work accomplishments or Kofi's industry recognitions with the same casual thoroughness she brought to telling me about the weather. I listened. I said that was wonderful, and I offered nothing back. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation, the same instinct that had made me study alone in my room at 12 years old when I realized the kitchen table wasn't producing the audience I was hoping for. I applied to Meridian Tech Solutions again in January of my 29th year. Different position this time, Director of Product, one full level above the senior PM role I hadn't gotten 18 months earlier. Salary range $118,000 to $135,000. I had Thomas Drummond's referral because he knew Sandra Kinnear from an industry board they'd both served on, and he had sent her an email the week before my application that I wasn't supposed to know about, but which Kezia confirmed existed through a LinkedIn timestamp she monitored with a level of professional dedication I found both unnecessary and entirely characteristic of her. 4 interview rounds over 6 weeks. Each round more precise than the last, each one requiring me to have done not just the preparation, but the thinking beneath the preparation, the kind of thinking that happens when you've been building your expertise in the margins of your regular job for 3 years because you had nowhere else to build it. In the final panel interview, Sandra Kinnear looked at me across a conference room table and said, "We almost hired you 18 months ago." I looked back at her and said, "I know. I've spent the time since then making sure you had fewer reasons not to the second time." She wrote something in her notepad. This time, she also smiled. The offer came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in the Harwell Group parking lot, missed the call, returned it standing between 2 parked cars, with the Atlanta sun too bright and warm for the season. Base salary $127,500. Equity package, full benefits including a graduate tuition reimbursement program I would later use to cover the first 18 months of an executive MBA at Georgia Tech's Scheller College of Business. I sat in my car for 6 minutes after I hung up. Not to compose myself, exactly. I was composed. It was more that I needed a moment alone with the fact of it, before it became something I shared with anyone else, because shared things change shape the moment they leave you, and I had been protecting this particular shape for 3 years. I called Kezia first, she screamed, the single most satisfying sound I have ever heard in a parking lot. I called Thomas Drummond second, and he said, "I know, Sandra texted me, you earned this completely." I called Andre third and he said, "Come over tonight," and I drove to his apartment in Summerhill and ate his mother's gumbo recipe, which he'd been perfecting for 3 years. Incrementally, the way good people improve at things, with patience and attention and a refusal to rush the roux, and I cried twice during the evening, once at the kitchen table, and once standing at the sink while he washed the bowls, and he did not ask me why either time, which was exactly and precisely the right thing. I did not call my parents, not that day, not that week, and not because I was calculating an effect, because they had not been in the building. The people I needed to tell first were the people who had stood in the construction zone with me. My family had been in a separate city, inside a separate narrative in which I was someone who was still figuring things out, and I did not feel, honestly, that I owed them an announcement for a door they had not helped me open, or even believed I was standing in front of. The reversal, the moment that everything shifted in a way I hadn't engineered and couldn't have planned, happened 6 weeks after I started at Meridian, at my parents' 35th wedding anniversary dinner at South City Kitchen in Vinings. 15 family members around a long table, white tablecloths. The kind of restaurant my father chose for important occasions because the price communicated the occasion's importance. I almost didn't go. Andre sat with me while I decided, which meant he sat with me through about 40 minutes of me not deciding while pretending to decide, and then said, very calmly, "You can go, and it can be what it is. It doesn't have to be more than that." Which was the right thing to say, so I went. My Aunt Precious, my father's youngest sister, visiting from Houston for the occasion, a woman my father has described privately as someone whose relationship with discretion is complicated at best, was seated 2 chairs down from my father's left. Aunt Precious is 61 years old and has, over the course of 6 decades, developed an absolute immunity to the social pressure that keeps other people from saying the true and obvious thing in rooms where the true and obvious thing is not being said. She is either my favorite person or my least favorite person, depending on the day, and that night she was unambiguously my favorite person. My father stood mid-dinner to give a toast, because Emmanuel Okafor marks significant occasions with formal acknowledgement, and his toasts are constructed the way his reports are constructed. Everyone present is named, their contribution to the family structure is noted, their value is affirmed. When he got to me, he said, "Simone, who is always finding her way." 14 words that contained no information about me, required no knowledge of me, and confirmed that he did not have any. He moved immediately to his cousin Emeka, and then the toast concluded, and glasses were raised. Aunt Precious put down her fork. "Emmanuel," she said, the way a person says a name when they're about to use it as a hinge. "Do you know what Simone does for a living?" My father looked mildly surprised. "She works in technology, data analytics. She is the director of product at Meridian Tech Solutions in Midtown," Aunt Precious said, with the precision of someone who had done preparation. "I looked it up when I was trying to plan a lunch near her office this week. Do you know what the director of product at a mid-size Atlanta software company earns?" She looked at my father steadily. I looked that up too, because I was curious about my niece's professional life, and I would like to understand why I had to learn about it from a Google search, and not from her father's toast at his own anniversary dinner. The table went quiet in the exact way a table goes quiet when something true and heavy has been set down in the middle of it. My mother looked at her plate, not with the look of someone reaching for a response, with the look of someone performing the act of not being seen. My father looked at me, not with the surface attention of the toast, with something real and specific moving across his face, the look of a man who has just found an error in his calculations and is taking responsibility for having made it. "Is this correct?" he asked. His voice was measured. This was not a small question for my father. "I started 6 weeks ago," I said. "I worked toward it for 3 years." My cousin Regina quietly refilled my water glass. The table waited. My father looked at my mother. "Grace," he said. One word, her name, in a tone that contained everything he was not going to say in front of 15 people. And my mother, whose answer was some version of having heard me mention a new position, which was not remotely accurate, but which was, in its own way, more honest than anything she could have crafted, gave the table, without meaning to, a complete picture of what had been happening in that family for 3 decades. She had known, in whatever blurred form it had reached her through her own defenses, that I had built something significant, and she had chosen not to amplify it. The way she had always chosen not to amplify it. And my father, sitting there with the filing cabinet precision of a man who organizes his entire life around accurate accounting, understood what that choice meant and what it had cost. He finished the toast, he raised his glass, the dinner continued. But some rooms, once shifted, don't shift back, and that one didn't. What happened after the dinner, I learned the following morning from Aunt Precious, over breakfast at a Waffle House on Ponce de Leon, delivered in the precise and unhurried way she delivers all important information. My parents had talked until 1 a.m. My father had asked, calmly and repeatedly, how long my mother had been managing the family's understanding of my professional life, while simultaneously making Chioma's career a centerpiece of family conversation. My mother's defense, that she hadn't wanted to pressure me, had not satisfied my father, who had responded that there is a clear and navigable distinction between pressure and acknowledgement, and that one is something I had never requested, while the other is something every child is owed. I did not feel triumphant when Aunt Precious told me this. I want to be honest about that, because this story has a complicated emotional texture, and I'm not going to flatten it into something cleaner than it was. What I felt was closer to grief wearing different clothes, the recognition that the acknowledgement I had needed at 15 and 22 and 27 was arriving at 31 through a hinge opened by my aunt's Google search and my father's sense of structural integrity, and that it was better than nothing and also 20 years too late to be what it should have been. My father called me the morning after. Not to dissect the dinner. Emmanuel Okafor does not do post-mortems with the people involved. He does them privately and arrives at conclusions, but to ask me about my work. Genuinely, specifically, with the full attention of a man who builds things and respects other people who build things. I told him about Meridian, about the product lines I was managing, the team structure, the roadmap I was building for the following fiscal year. He listened the way he listens to infrastructure briefings, completely, without interrupting, asking the right clarifying questions at the right moments. When I finished, he said, "You've built this properly." In my father's lexicon, this is love. It arrived late. I held it anyway. With my mother, the conversation was slower and harder and more necessary. She called me a week after the dinner. She circled around what had happened, then around the blazer, using the word, that whole situation, for long enough that I finally stopped her and said, "I need you to say what it was, Mom. Not the situation. Tell me what you did." There was a long silence. Then she said, "I took scissors to something that was yours, and I didn't think about what it was going to cost you to lose it the night before something that mattered." I said nothing for a moment. She kept going. "And I've been doing a version of that for a long time. Not making space for your things to matter as much as other things. I don't know when that became something I did, but I know it was real, and I know it wasn't okay." She didn't say it perfectly. There were places where she retreated, and I had to redirect her gently back toward the specific truth. But it was real. The imperfect real thing is worth more than the perfect performed thing, and I had learned by then to tell the difference. Chioma called me on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after that, and she said, in the straightforward and undecorated way that Chioma speaks when she's not performing for anyone's benefit, "I should have asked before I took the blazer. And I should have called you myself when it happened. I let Mom handle it, and I knew that was wrong, and I didn't call anyway, and I'm sorry." I believed her. We're not close now, not in the way this story might seem to want us to be. We talk once or twice a month. We had coffee in December in Midtown, sat for 2 hours at a small table in a place near my office, and talked about real things: her marriage's recovery after the financial fracture, my work, Amara losing her first tooth, what kind of mothers we might have been raised to be if things had been arranged differently. We haven't resolved 29 years of family architecture in 3 conversations, but we are finally, for the first time, in the same story with each other, instead of separate stories our parents wrote about us because they needed us divided to keep the narrative working. I bought a new blazer 8 months ago, not a replacement for the midnight blue one, an intentional departure. Deep emerald green, silk wool blend, from a black-owned boutique called The Stitch in West Midtown, designed by a woman named Camille Rhodes, who has been building her label for 4 years from a studio the size of a guest room. The blazer cost $340. I paid for it in one transaction, no installments, because I could, and because I wanted the act of paying for it to feel different from the act of paying for the midnight blue one. Not desperate, not careful, not spread across 3 months of budgeting, but clear and direct and mine. I wore it to my first all-hands meeting as director of product. Sandra Kinnear looked at me across a conference room with 16 people in it and said, "That color is extraordinary on you." I said, "I picked it on purpose." And I had, in more ways than the obvious one. The midnight blue blazer is in a box in my bedroom closet, left sleeve nearly detached, 4-inch cut across the back panel, one gold button missing at the right cuff. I haven't thrown it away. Dr. Maya Curtis, my therapist, whom I have been seeing for over a year, through a private practice in Decatur off Church Street, has suggested more than once, gently and without pressure, that releasing it might free up some interior space I'm using to store something I no longer need to carry. Maybe. Not yet. What I know is that the blazer is the most accurate physical record I have of what it cost to become who I am. Not just the specific betrayal of that one night, but the long pattern that night was part of. The accumulated weight of being the one whose things didn't quite matter, whose achievements went unannounced, whose closet space was available for someone else's use without permission. The blazer is the evidence. I'm not ready to discard evidence. I'm still living the case it makes. I am sitting in my home office right now as I tell you this. The 3rd bedroom of the condo I bought in Kirkwood last spring, $298,000. Andre's name on the deed next to mine, because last September he asked me, standing in the kitchen of his Summer Hill apartment on a Tuesday night, whether I wanted to build something together that was actually ours. I said yes, without having to think about it for long, because I have learned at some real cost what it feels like to have a person who asks instead of assumes, who checks with me before he lends out my things, who made a note of my small nervousnesses and followed up on them. The Pragmatic Institute certificate is framed on the wall. My Georgia Tech Scheller MBA first-year completion certificate is next to it. On the bookshelf behind me, there is a photograph from a birthday dinner at Ponce City Market. Thomas Drummond to my left, Kezia and Jerome Osei across from us, Andre beside me, all of us in the particular soft light of a restaurant that was worth the reservation. That is my family, the one I built out of choices, the one where my things stay where I put them. There's one last thing I want to ask you before I go, and I want you to answer me honestly, because I think your answer will tell you something true about yourself. If you were standing in that hallway in Decatur, Georgia, holding the midnight blue blazer in pieces, the night before the interview that could change the trajectory of your career, what would you have done? Would you have screamed? Would you have broken something in return? Would you have walked out without saying a word? Or would you have driven to a 24-hour Target and bought a $32.99 polyester blazer and gone to that interview anyway and told yourself in a dressing room mirror that you were doing it regardless? Tell me what you would have done. Leave it in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, check the description below.